We're a mission-driven organisation. We exist to accelerate the move to a decarbonised future. The way we do that is by working either with organisations one-on-one, and the other thing that we do is really convening stakeholders across a sector to drive system-level change.
This is Climate Rising, a podcast from Harvard Business School. I'm your host, Mike Toffel. Today we're exploring a question that many companies are grappling with. How do you communicate climate progress in a way that's both credible and compelling? My guest is Julia Nicoara, Marketing and Communication Director at Carbon Trust, an organization that works with companies around the world to measure, reduce, and communicate their climate impact. Here's my conversation with Julia Nicoara. Julia, thank you so much for joining us here on Climate Rising.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
So Julia, why don't we get started with a brief introduction of you and your role at Carbon Trust?
Sure. I'm the Marketing and Communications Director at the Carbon Trust. The Carbon Trust is a climate action organisation that's been here for 25 years, so working in this space from way before it was as topical and as well known as it is today. My job is really to work with my team and the rest of the organisation to grow the awareness of the Carbon Trust, so more and more businesses, governments, financial institutions hear of us and work with us on their own decarbonisation climate action journeys. And then I also work with them to help them communicate those actions that they have taken in a way that helps them tell their story and really protects their reputation. So it's been 6 years that I've been with the Carbon Trust. And before that, I used to work for Fair Trade, which is a workers' rights organisation. Also very strongly linked to communicating the right thing to do in your supply chain. And before that, I spent 10 years at Mars. So I was on, so I suppose, the other side of the coin, where I obviously worked as part of big brands trying to tell their stories as well. So my background is a combination of not-for-profit, corporate and consulting across this wonderful space.
Great. So when you talk about storytelling, who are the recipients of that story? Are these primarily consumers, or are you also trying to communicate to the public at large, regulators, investors, or is it mostly consumers in your case?
In the case of the Carbon Trust, is mostly businesses or financial institutions or governments or public sector organizations. They are the primary partners that we work with. So if I can explain maybe a little bit of how the Carbon Trust achieves impact. We're a mission-driven organization. We exist to accelerate the move to a decarbonised future. The way we do that is by working either with organisations one-on-one. There might be big corporate brands that you will have heard of, Heineken, Velux, Amazon, etc. Helping them directly on their carbon reduction strategies, embedding those into their business, extracting commercial value from them, and then communicating that to their either internally, so their internal stakeholders, shareholders, or externally. So there's a one-on-one advisory work that we do. And the other thing that we do is really convening stakeholders across a sector to drive system-level change. So, for example, the offshore wind accelerator is something that was launched by the Carbon Trust over 15 years ago, and it was really bringing together all the players in the space of offshore wind in the UK. So if you think about what it takes to make renewable energy work, let's take offshore wind, you need to put a wind turbine somewhere. That turbine is made by someone. There are cables, there is the landowner, there's the grid, there are companies who are involved in this entire supply chain. The Carbon Trust brought them together to solve very complicated problems. There is a significant cost reduction in offshore wind and renewable energy coming from wind in the UK. So that's the second way in which the Carbon Trust drives action and impact, is really bringing together stakeholders so that together we can solve some of these really big, complicated problems. We do also have the consumer angle to our audience, and that comes through the Carbon Trust Footprint label, which is there for consumers to understand the impact of their shopping better. The communication is still primarily aimed at businesses because they are the ones that adopt it, so to speak. They are the ones that need to do the work in order to get the Carbon Trust label. But the label itself, what it says on it, and the accompanying materials that we use to give the transparency, they are aimed at consumers.
Great. So let's walk through these various service lines. There's lots of players out there who are engaging in this work. Of course, companies like your prior company, Mars, I'm sure has its own team internally. Then there's like technical consultants out there. There's management consultants out there. And there's a couple of NGOs like yours who are all offering advisory services. How would you say the Carbon Trust differentiates itself from some of those other players?
There are a few ways that I would call out in which we do differentiate ourselves. We bring a unique combination of sector depth, knowledge. By sector, I mean, if you think about the world, the systems that we operate in, there are a few sectors such as the energy sector, agriculture, transport, aviation, retail, manufacturing, that between them really make up the most of the world's carbon emissions. And the Carbon Trust has deep expertise within most of these. When I say deep, I mean it has worked with multiple players within one sector, and so is able to connect those dots within that particular sector. Let's take, for example, agriculture. If you think about the players that are the stakeholders, the players that are in that system, it's anywhere from a farmer to a manufacturer to a retailer. They have different issues. They have some common issues, some different ones, and then there's a set of solutions. We have worked across this one sector, so we have the depth. And we've been doing this for 25 years, which is not something that many other organizations in this space can say. So we combine that sector depth with deep expertise, but we also add that breadth that I was talking about. So it's not just one sector that we know very well, it's multiple sectors. And therefore we are able to bring those interdependencies. So for example, the ICT sector, so the information, digital, etc., sector, is heavily connected to energy. And they might be separate, but they're interconnected because of where you get the energy from, the cost of the energy, etc. So what makes us distinctive is this combination of depth and breadth, backed up by 25 years of experience. And then you said we were an NGO. We're not an NGO, so we are a commercial organisation, but we are not for profit. So we are independent. We don't have shareholders, and therefore any surplus we do make in our P&L is reinvested back into our mission. And so when you work with the Carbon Trust, not only do you get the expertise, but you also get that independence and the motivation being around the mission, which ultimately benefits all of us.
Is there an example or two of client engagement that you can walk us through where you help them discover new opportunities for decarbonization that they went ahead and adopted?
Let me give you a few examples that are fresh in the mind. So I'm speaking to you from London, United Kingdom. And last week we had London Climate Action Week. We held a few events actually, one of which was on labelling, carbon footprint labelling. I moderated a panel. We had Nestle Waters there, we had Amazon Climate Pledge Friendly, we had Bureau Veritas, which is an accreditation body. And we heard, for example, from Nestle Waters telling the story of how they implemented the Carbon Trust label on their Italian water range, so San Pellegrino. And it was really good to hear from those involved. And only the previous day we'd hosted another event, which is part of a series called The Business of Climate Action. And I would actually, if you're interested in looking at this, you can find it on our website. It's really a hub of interviews with different sustainability and business leaders who talk to our experts about their journeys, their organization's journeys, and how they have implemented what they learned from us, and not just from the Carbon Trust. It's not a self-promotion exercise. It's very much about helping others learn from their peers. So the Business of Climate Action is an event series. It's a platform which brings together these stories, and it is about storytelling. Actually, if you do have a chance to check it out, and you hopefully get a sense of community and of how there are many other professionals in your shoes if you're in sustainability, in climate action, but there is help out there, and then there are solutions. So do have a look if you are interested.
Great, and we'll provide a link to that in the show notes of this episode. So let's pivot and talk about the communication piece of the storytelling, which involves, at least in part, the Carbon Trust label that you mentioned a moment ago. Now, if I recall, this label was founded a long time ago and has had a bit of an evolution in terms of what it was seeking to communicate to consumers. So can you tell us a bit about the story of the origins and the evolution of the Carbon Trust label?
Sure. The Carbon Trust label was founded in 2007, so that's almost 20 years ago. And I'm not sure how many of the listeners can cast their mind back to 20 years ago, but the world looked quite different when it comes to this space around climate action and sustainability, and it took a while for it to take off. So if you think about how labeling actually works, you need the consumers to pull, so you need them to be interested enough.
Yeah.
But you really need the brands to adopt. It is the brand that carries the label.
Yeah.
It is the brand that has to do the work to get the label. They are the ones who need to measure their carbon footprint, to understand their carbon footprint, to commit to reduce that carbon footprint, to then reduce that footprint and so on. So you do need this triangle of the brand, the consumer, and then the verifier in the case of the Carbon Trust and the labeling organization. And so it took a while for this to really take off, because as I said, in 2007, this wasn't top of mind for consumers.
So I also imagine for brands, being first to affix a carbon burden to your products also might seem unattractive, because you're highlighting what some consumers might seem to be a problem, and you're being compared to the absence of the revelation of a problem from another brand. And so I could imagine that might have been a difficult thing for any brand to move on their own, as opposed to perhaps an industry or a grocer who wants to require everyone so that there's choice. Because just putting up that my product has this much carbon is, absent comparisons, seems like it could be perhaps only a drawback rather than an advantage.
And that's actually how labeling evolved, and that's how we not just the Carbon Trust, but many others, and journeyed towards labels such as, for instance, carbon neutral, which wasn't a number on a pack of how much carbon was emitted during your the cradle to grave production of your product, but it was telling you something about that particular product's credentials, if you like, environmental credentials. And I would say that, you know, labels are given as a result of a verification process that is linked to a standard that is robust, as was the example of carbon neutral, for example, and the Carbon Trust had labels such as measured or reducing at that time, which they weren't really saying, weren't giving you an absolute number, but they were showing an intent, they were showing a trajectory. And actually it was the advantage of the first mover that persuaded brands to adopt this label at a greater scale than it had been before. So it was really reassuring during London Climate Action Week that I've just mentioned that we had in the room Amazon. And Amazon have a program called Climate Pledge Friendly, which is really, if you're shopping on their platform, you can see a small green leaf, and you know that product carries a label, a climate label. It's a multitude, so it's not just the carbon transport. There's quite a few of them. But you can see what that label is, you can read about it, you can make a decision whether you wish to purchase that particular product, which does carry a Climate Pledge Friendly, it's part of that program, or not. And there is a notable sales uplift in the USA on sales of Climate Pledge Friendly products compared to previous years' non-labeled products. So there's no more valuable evidence than from the retailer themselves who says, yes, consumers do care. So therefore, I think as a brand, talking about the value of putting something like a label on your pack, it did show competitive advantage, and it still does.
You've mentioned actually what I consider three types of labels in your description. There's one type of label that says this product's carbon footprint is 7 grams per ounce or something like that, a footprint burden. Then there's a carbon neutral statement, which says to the extent that this product emits carbon, we've taken measures to eliminate or sequester, reduce whatever the language is, that much carbon out of the atmosphere. And so it's sort of a break-even phenomenon. That's an attribute rather than a detriment. And then just now, the climate pledge friendly, which is an interesting turn of phrase because the climate pledge is, as you mentioned, a commitment to reduce. It doesn't particularly state by how much or over what time frame, but it at least to the consumer, it suggests that someone has validated the statement that we are on our way toward reduction.
So Climate Pledge Friendly is not a label. Climate Pledge Friendly is a program. It really is like an umbrella that brings together multiple climate labels, and it's those labels that verify that you are on your way. All Climate Pledge Friendly does is it just puts an umbrella around them and says, have a look for some more detail if you're interested. So I think it is important to distinguish between a label and a claim, and you usually will get a label, like I said before, following a verification process, which does, the verification does happen around a standard. And now, for example, in Europe, in order to really tighten transparency and give consumers the confidence and greater understanding of what they're buying, you can't measure your footprint, have it verified and then labeled by the same organization. So essentially you can't mark your own homework. If you have someone that helps you measure your carbon footprint, then another organization will have to verify that.
Right. A way to reduce conflict. A way to reduce conflicts of interest.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So labeling does give you that more robust standard verification, third party, than a claim. And there are many organizations who make claims that they can't substantiate. And I think that's really the risk, I think, of more and more organizations taking climate action and wanting to communicate. That's good. There's momentum. It encourages other organizations to do so. Some do overclaim. That leads to greenwashing. But there's more and more legislation now that is trying to restrict that greenwashing, which is good because we don't want consumers to be misled. But it does also lead to organizations worrying that they might get it wrong, they might be fined, and then they prefer to not say anything, which is a shame, actually, because you lose that momentum. You also don't necessarily give consumers the ability to make more informed choices by telling them what the environmental impact of that particular product or service is. So it's a really fine balance where, between overclaiming and not saying anything at all.
So let's talk a little bit more about this regulation. I know the EU has moved on this somewhat recently. There's traditionally been some regulation and guidance in the U.S. about this. I mean, there's long been sort of anti-fraudulent claims on packaging. That's been without anything to do with climate per se, but just more broadly. Can't say things that are false or misleading. So walk us through, if you would, just where are the places where there's been some movement on regulations of labeling or greenwashing that companies are having to grapple with now?
The most recent one is in Europe with the Green Claims Directive. And I don't know the detail, but I know there's been new regulation or looking at regulation and consulting on regulation in the US and Canada. And I know there's been quite a strong attempt here in the UK from the CMA and the ASA, all the acronyms, to tighten regulation. And I do think it's a good thing, because the intent, like I said before, is to minimize the risk of overclaim, to drive some uniformity in the types of claims that you can make. It is called the Empowering Consumers Act, to empower consumers to make more informed choices. I do worry that it will lead to some organisations staying silent, as I said, for fear of getting it wrong. There are resources available in your local, in your country, or organisations like the Carbon Trust, for example. We created, a marketeer's guide to communicating. We created a factual guide on how to, avoid some of the most usual mistakes.
So those regulations you're describing are about sort of truth in advertising. Like, if you're going to make a claim, it has to be validated, It has to follow standard protocols, etc.
Yes, exactly. So the European one that I'm referring to is very much about, you can only make claims that you can substantiate. You can't make generic claims like green without explaining what's behind them. Various other things that link to being able to claim only when it can be substantiated.
Great. So let me take us out of our conversation by asking you sort of a combined question here. So if you could help us see the future of Carbon Trust and where it's heading, and at the same time offer any advice or suggested materials for those interested in learning more, not just about Carbon Trust, but about the whole movement that we've been talking about.
Let's start with the first one. I think the future of the Carbon Trust will be really accelerating through collaboration. I think it's been doing this for some time, but now I think we have that breadth of sectors: the energy sector, agriculture, ICT, manufacturing, mining. These between them represent the most of the world's carbon emissions. And so we have a vision for the decarbonisation of these sectors globally. And you can't decarbonise energy without working on coal, which is in Asia, for example, in large part, not exclusively. So I can see in our future more and more convening of very influential, relevant stakeholders to solve these difficult problems, so that we can reduce carbon emissions and therefore reduce warming, and therefore hopefully some of these impacts that we're seeing around us in terms of the change in climate. In terms of advice, I think there are many sources that you can listen to. There's podcasts, Outrage and Optimism, that I think gives you just enough of both, and is very educational. I read The Economist, for example, and they have an excellent climate section. I listen to their podcast, or I read. I try to get my information from the most straightforward sources, because I think if you go deeply technical, you can get lost and be bored if you're not in this space. So my advice is start, unless you are already studying, I don't know, climate or engineering. But then I suppose, step 2 advice is try to understand how climate change, literally the way the climate is changing, is impacting everything around us. Health. So if you're in that space, it will impact you, because more people will get sick, more people will get various problems with heat and so on. If you're in buildings, more and more buildings will need air-seed. If you're in banking, what are you funding? What kind of companies? Where is the money going? If you are in a FMCG company making chocolate, where's the cocoa coming from? And will there still be cocoa or coffee in 20 years' time? So climate change is not a concept. It's actually very much something that impacts everyday life, and pretty much a lot of the jobs that the audience here will be in or going into. So how you understand that and tell that story internally and drive the case for change is really important.
Great. And we'll provide links to all those materials on show notes. I'm a big fan of many of those podcasts you mentioned. Great. Well, thank you so much, Julia, for spending your time with us. We really appreciate your perspectives.
It's been a real pleasure. Thank you very much.
That was my conversation with Julia Nicoara, Marketing and Communication Director at Carbon Trust. Climate Rising is produced by Sophie Wong. Craig McDonald is our audio engineer. Video production by WT Creative. I'm your host, Mike Toffel. Climate Rising is a production of the Harvard Business School Business and Environment Initiative. Thanks for joining us.